A haunting can come in many forms, and while some are only witnessed by a single individual or at best by a select few, others are ever present and display their actions for whomever is on hand at the time that they choose to manifest. This story is about one poltergeist's ability to interact with the living, and whose willingness to do so was so common that by virtue of its very existence was even given its own name. So keep a close eye on your surroundings tonight, because this is extremely strange. On a quite typical street in Cardiff, Wales, sometime in the 1980s, John Matthews ran a lawnmower repair shop called Mower Services. Business there was steady but uneventful, until one day when John and a friend, Ian, were inside working, and they were interrupted by a loud bang on the sheet metal roof of the garage. The loud thump was followed by another, which prompted an annoyed Matthews, suspecting some mischievous kids were likely throwing rocks at the building, to run outside to confront them. But when he exited the garage, he saw no one in the alley leading to the property or in the street to scold. John was left a bit confused as to the non-existence of anyone responsible for the noises, but put it out of his mind and went back to work. What John didn't know at the time was this otherwise peaceful and nondescript setting was about to be plunged into the realm of the supernatural. The following day, Ian noticed some wrenches hanging on a wall inexplicably swinging back and forth. Considering the absence of a breeze through the shop and him working alone, seemed a bit odd, but after reaching out to stop the tools from moving, he returned to his work. Immediately, the wrenches began to sway again, and as Ian paused to consider another explanation, one flew off its perch on a nearby shelf and hit the floor. When he turned to look at where it landed, he was suddenly hit in the chest by a stone. Totally perplexed and growing a bit edgy concerning what was happening, he irritably picked up the rock and tossed it into a corner, only to have it come shooting back at him. He then repeatedly picked up the stone to toss it away, only to have it return to him each time he did so. He then summoned John to come and observe what was taking place. He once again picked up the stone and tossed it aside, and this time, with John looking on, the stone was again thrown back at him with such force it hit the wall directly behind him. In the days that followed, this repeated phenomena became so commonplace that it became something of a game played inside the garage, with nuts and bolts or ball bearings often replacing stones, and in almost every instance, they would be returned in kind to their sender. Some chosen friends visiting would be encouraged to try their hand at this peculiar sport, and most would be rewarded with a return toss. John, his wife Pat, as well as the rest of the crew, would otherwise keep the strange phenomenon quiet so as not to potentially scare away customers. Pat would claim that one corner of the shop would inexplicably turn ice cold, which was accompanied by a terrible burning smell. At one point, determined to eliminate any possibility of a prank, John locked the garage doors and had everyone present place their hands on a bench in clear sight of each other. He asked for a stone to be thrown, and, on cue, one skittered across the floor behind them. When John suggested they begin keeping a journal of the activity, a pen suddenly appeared and dropped onto the bench in front of them. One somewhat skeptical friend told of the time John invited him over and asked him to take note of anything odd he experienced. When he began to hear a kind of tapping noise on the roof, John essentially told him the festivities were about to begin, and informed him that what he was hearing were stones being tossed. He was then taken into the shop and told to pick up one off the floor and throw it into a corner. As he complied with this strange request, he watched in astonishment as it slid across the floor right back to him. While slightly unnerved, He was then told to look toward a wall, where he saw the wrenches begin to do their macabre dance one after another while hanging there. He was now convinced something strange was happening, allowing a contented Matthews to tell him in so many words, "I told you so." Bewilderment soon turned to bemusement, as everyone concluded that a playful force was present in the shop, that while mischievous was quite benign, and as a result grew to become something of an extended family member. The increasing fondness for the entity resulted in it being named Pete the Poltergeist. Pete enjoyed hiding things like car and house keys, only to return them 5 to 10 minutes later when he was satisfied the owner was totally exasperated looking for them, and would continue to play toss with stones and hardware, ultimately demonstrating the willingness to comply with instructions given to him. At one point, a paper clip dropped out of thin air onto John's desk as he was speaking to a customer, and when the customer, who was already privy to the goings-on there, asked Pete for another, an entire box of clips materialized out of thin air and dropped onto the desk. The customer then asked Pete for some paper, and both men watched as a single sheet floated from the ceiling to the floor and landed behind them. Before long, the activity spread to John's home, where objects were manipulated or thrown from shelves. A favorite target became the children's toys, which would be moved and sometimes found broken, with a favorite of Pete's being a Rubik's Cube. Pete continued to display the means to seemingly materialize objects upon request, such as the day John asked his wife for a banana, and while the request was barely out of his mouth, one landed in front of him. The same would happen with kitchen utensils. This would extend to ridding the house of items Pete wasn't fond of, such as oranges, because each time some were brought in, they would be found tossed out a window. Pete also became a quasi-mechanic's apprentice, as he would drop or slide whatever tool was requested across the floor. He was also quick with a non-verbal pun or a gag. When someone asked for an electrical plug, he tossed them a spark plug instead. Appreciating Pete's wry sense of humor, John's brother-in-law Fred once kiddingly asked for a Rolls Royce, and to his amazement, a key ring bearing the insignia RR was dropped at his feet, though the appearance of the vehicle itself was likely too large an ask. With seemingly limitless possibilities, Pete was lightheartedly asked to produce money. So, for 5 years without fail, each day, pennies, 2 pence, 5 pence, and 1 pound coins would appear. At one point, 68 pence were gathered up in an hour's time. Soon they would collect around 5 pounds a month, and at one point, while drinking a cup of tea with his flabbergasted wife, a 1 pound coin splashed into John's cup. Often, 5 or 10 pound notes were found stuck in the ceiling tiles. John decided the phenomenon surrounding Pete needed to be shared with an academic, so he called upon University professor David Fontana, whom he knew had an interest in the paranormal, to come over and bear personal witness to the strangeness. To eliminate any possible shenanigans, Fontana would show up unannounced at varied times to maintain a level of control over the proceedings. On his very first visit, he saw a stone bounce off a piece of machinery as John, who was busy with a sales representative at the time, told the bewildered professor that Pete was just greeting him by saying hello. Fontana claimed never to see the objects in mid-flight, but only as they touched down, signaling they were, for all intents and purposes, aported to the scene. It wasn't long before Fontana's involvement and a subsequent paper he filed on the case brought increased public attention to the shop, which included the media, a surprising amount of customers wishing to witness Pete's efforts, 2 priests, and an insurance assessor who was present one day to investigate a claim stemming from a break-in at the garage. He had no previous knowledge of what was happening at the shop, but taking a peek inside a room for himself, watched as a stone whizzed across the floor with no one else anywhere near him. Interestingly, One of the two churches on either side of the shop had begun to experience their own poltergeist-like activity. Reverend Mike Fuller claimed that while working in his office, he heard stones hitting the window. Looking out the window and then venturing outside, he saw no one that might be responsible. Upon returning to his desk, the stone throwing resumed. This experience preceded any of his first-hand knowledge of what was going on in the shop right next door. Soon, Pete became the darling of the UK, leaving believers and skeptics alike at a loss for words. For years to follow, his exploits would be witnessed and retold by visitors, but the last remaining piece of the puzzle was, who is Pete? That answer would come from an unexpected source, John's brother-in-law Fred, who apparently became the only person Pete would show himself to, and did so on multiple occasions. Fred described him as a small boy, likely from the 1940s, who was wearing a cap and waved to him, though his facial features were blurred. Fred initially saw him sitting on a high shelf where they kept spare parts, but when he told John to look at what he was seeing, Pete would vanish from sight. It seemed after that Pete became increasingly attached to Fred and would often remain in his company and focus most of his energies on him. When the growing business was eventually moved to a larger location, Pete stayed on so as to remain with Fred at his home. A rash of activity would take place there, like pictures rotating within their frames, spoons being thrown on the stairs, and coins continuing to be found around the house. Regrettably, Pete's constant presence and hijinks became so overwhelming that Fred and his wife opted to move away in order to distance themselves from the mounting intensity of Pete's constant company. Since that time, the area appears to be free of Pete's presence, and nothing unusual has been reported since. No one associated with the shop has ever reported any further contact with him. This is a case that was investigated by the prestigious Society for Psychical Research, but largely due to the absence of anything terrifying going on, I feel the case has been largely underreported. But I do think I probably feel your sense of sadness that Pete's friends all moved away and seemingly abandoned the little guy. But that's not necessarily the case. Because, you see, Fred Cook and his wife consulted a psychic before they moved away, and while I don't know this for certain, I have a feeling that given everyone's relationship with Pete, that there was likely some form of crossing over ceremony performed. Let's hope that was the case, and Pete is now in the company of loved ones. As we've just seen, not every haunting results in those affected screaming out in terror or fleeing the building. There are many instances when those who have passed on return in peace and interact positively with the living. So maybe the story of Pete the Poltergeist won't keep you up at night, but you might sleep more soundly knowing that his visitation made everyone's life he touched a little better for what he brought to them.